All right, diving in, you guys really stacked the deck this time. All this stuff about Dr. Laura Williams and her book, What to Do When You Feel Broken, excerpts, and the intro, chapters, even some personal stories. Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing collection to work with, for sure.
So get ready to go deep on this one. We're going to figure out what makes this book tick and why it's resonating with so many people who are, looking to kind of heal and become whole.
One of the things that really struck me is that Dr. Williams isn't just some, armchair therapist talking about stuff she's read. She's actually a clinical psychologist.
Oh, right. And a trauma therapist, too, if I remember correctly.
You got it. And she's walked the walk herself. She's used these very ideas she writes about in her own life to deal with her own stuff.
That's got to give it a whole different weight, right? Like, it's not just theory, it's lived experience.
Exactly. It brings a whole other level of authenticity to her work.
So this isn't just for people who've lived through, like, major trauma, like capital T trauma.
That's one of the things that makes this book so unique, actually. She talks about this idea of small t trauma, the everyday hurts, those things that might not seem like a big deal at the time, but they can really add up and, leave their mark.
She even shares examples from her own life, right?
Oh, yeah, all kinds of things, like being compared to her sister or feeling the pressure to achieve, or even just witnessing, like, her mom's people-pleasing behaviors. These seemingly small things can really shape who we become.
Okay, so that's intriguing. By sharing these personal anecdotes, Dr. Williams is kind of normalizing the idea that we all carry some level of trauma, right?
Right, exactly. It's like she's saying, hey, feeling broken is actually pretty normal. And that in itself can be so validating, especially for people who've been struggling in silence.
So let's dig into that small t trauma a bit more. How does she actually define it? And what kind of impact can these seemingly minor things have on us long term?
So she contrasts it with what she calls big T trauma, the stuff we typically think of like, major accidents or abuse or, those big life-altering events. Small T trauma, on the other hand, is more about the subtle but consistent blows to our sense of self. Repeated criticism, feeling unheard or unseen in your family, constantly being the good one, those kinds of things.
And she argues these small traumas can lead to pretty significant issues later on in life, right?
Absolutely. Things like perfectionism or the constant need to please people, even just having difficulty expressing your emotions.
Interesting. And she ties a lot of this back to her own experience with perfectionism, right? I mean, she's very upfront about her struggles with it.
Oh, yeah. And she traces it right back to her childhood. Things like competing with her sister, being in high-pressure environments. Those early experiences really shaped her.
It's a powerful example of how small t trauma can manifest in different ways.
Mm.
And for someone listening, it might be that aha moment, that realization that, hey, maybe this is happening in my life too.
Exactly. And that's where the real work begins, that self-reflection.
Okay, so how do you think someone listening could start to identify these small t traumas from their own past? What are some of the signs that these things might be at play?
I think it all starts with taking some time to reflect. Think back to your childhood, your early relationships. Were there any recurring patterns, events, or dynamics that just made you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, or even just unseen?
Like what? Give us some concrete examples.
Well, think about things like maybe you were always compared to a sibling, or maybe you felt this constant pressure to meet expectations that were just way too high, or maybe you were the peacekeeper in a chaotic family, always trying to smooth things over.
I remember her talking about specific journal prompts in the book, too, right? Like targeted questions that help people really delve into those early experiences.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great way to get those wheels turning. And it's not about dwelling on the past. It's about understanding how those experiences might be showing up in your life right now.
So, like, what kinds of things should we be looking for in the present? What are some of the clues?
Well, ask yourself, do you find yourself constantly trying to please people? Do you have a really hard time saying no? Or maybe you struggle with perfectionism, always feeling like you're not good enough. These could be signs that small t trauma is kind of lurking beneath the surface.
Which brings us to perfectionism. And Dr. Williams really dives deep into that whole topic.
Oh, yeah. She doesn't just talk about perfectionism as one thing. She breaks it down into 3 different types.
3? I only know of one. The kind that makes me stay up all night rewriting podcast scripts.
Haha. Well, that might be a sign of one of the types, for sure. But yeah, she talks about self-oriented perfectionism, other-oriented, and socially prescribed.
Okay, let's break those down because I think it would be super helpful for our listeners to get a clear picture of what each of these looks like in real life.
Yeah, for sure. So self-oriented perfectionism is all about those ridiculously high standards we set for ourselves, you know? If you're constantly criticizing yourself, never feeling good enough, always striving for that, like, flawless image.
Sounds exhausting.
Mhm.
And what about other oriented perfectionism?
That's when you expect that same level of perfection from, like, everyone else, you know?
Yeah.
Your partner, your friends, your colleagues. Nobody can quite measure up.
Yikes. You're that person always delegating and then taking it all back because no one did it right.
Yeah, or you might be super critical, have trouble delegating because you're convinced no one can do it as well as you can.
Oof, I know a few people like that. And what about that third type? Socially prescribed.
This one can be a little sneaky, actually. It's the feeling that the whole world expects perfection from you. You're driven by this fear of judgment, this constant worry about not living up to some external standard. Making mistakes can feel terrifying because you're convinced everyone will disapprove.
I think we all experience that to some degree, right?
Yeah.
Especially in today's social media world where everyone's curating these perfect lives.
Totally. And that's why it's important to get curious about those underlying beliefs, you know? Like, what are those deeper fears that might be driving this need to be perfect?
Okay, so how would someone figure out which type or types of perfectionism might be affecting them? Is it just like a gut feeling?
It really comes back to self-awareness. Start paying attention to those areas in your life where you feel the most pressure, the most self-critical. Is it at work, in your relationships? And then think about the beliefs that are fueling those feelings. Are you terrified of failure? Do you crave approval from others? By getting honest about those deeper motivations, you can start to see which type of perfectionism might be at play.
Makes sense. And I think Dr. Williams makes this whole thing so relatable because she's so open about her own struggles with perfectionism. She even calls it a vicious circle.
Right, and she talks about like how hard it was for her to delegate, or how she felt this constant need to be in control, even how she thought her partner expected perfection from her. Sharing those personal struggles is so powerful because it makes you realize, hey, I'm not alone in this.
I know, I was definitely thinking, wow, this woman gets it. It's refreshing to have an expert who's willing to be so vulnerable and honest about their own challenges.
Totally. It makes the book feel so much more authentic, you know. It reinforces this key idea that self-compassion is essential. We can't heal if we're constantly beating ourselves up for not being perfect.
Recognizing that we're all imperfect, that's a huge step toward letting go of that need for perfection.
Couldn't agree more. It's a journey, for sure.
And speaking of journeys, I know Dr. Williams also spends a good chunk of the book talking about attachment theory and how our early experiences shape our relationships later in life.
Ah, yes. Attachment theory. It's a fascinating lens to look at relationships through. It basically dives into how those early childhood experiences, especially with our caregivers, shape the way we relate to ourselves and the others as we grow up.
I remember that story she tells about choosing her mother over her father and her husband's funeral. It was so striking.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that's attachment in action.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of just how deep those attachment patterns run, you know? And it highlights how those early caregivers really shape our sense of safety and security in the world, even decades later.
It's not deterministic, though, right? It's not like we're doomed to repeat the patterns we learned in childhood.
No, not at all. It's about awareness. Attachment theory gives us this amazing framework for understanding those patterns. It helps us see where those old wounds might be impacting our lives today and how we can start to heal those wounds and create healthier relationships.
So how do we actually start to see those patterns in our own lives?
Well, I'd say start by looking at your current relationships with your partner, your friends, even your kids. Are there any recurring themes or dynamics that keep popping up?
Give us an example. Like, what kind of themes should we be looking for?
Well, think about it like this. Do you tend to get really anxious when someone pulls away? Or do you find it hard to let people in emotionally? Maybe you always end up in relationships where you feel unseen or unheard. Those could be signs that those old attachment patterns are playing out.
It's not about blaming our parents, though, right? It's about recognizing the impact they had and then figuring out how to move forward.
Exactly. It's not about placing blame. It's about understanding. It's about recognizing that those patterns exist and seeing how they might be influencing us today. That awareness is the first step to creating something different.
So are we saying that everything is because of our parents?
Not everything, but our relationship with our parents is, it's often the first relationship we have, right? So it makes sense that it would have this ripple effect throughout our lives.
Yeah. I know Dr. Williams is a big proponent of CBT, but she also talks about its limitations when it comes to dealing with these deeper relational issues, right?
You're right. She actually acknowledges that while CBT can be really effective for a lot of people, it doesn't always address those underlying causes, especially when you're talking about unresolved childhood trauma.
Like it helps you manage the symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily get to the root of the problem.
Exactly. And she illustrates this beautifully with the case of Megan, this woman who struggled with severe anxiety and depression after a very traumatic birth experience with her twins.
Right. And Megan's story is a perfect example of how these unresolved issues from childhood can kind of resurface in adulthood. They can get triggered by major life events.
Right. Like in Megan's case, those early experiences with like separation and emotional neglect from her parents, they really shaped her core beliefs about herself. She ended up feeling like fundamentally unlovable. And when she became a mother, all of that came rushing back. All those old wounds were suddenly wide open again.
So in Megan's case, did Dr. Williams just completely ditch CBT?
No, not at all. But she recognized that she needed a more comprehensive approach, a more holistic one. So she ended up integrating techniques that focused on like attachment, trauma processing, and emotional regulation alongside CBT.
Ah, that makes sense. Like taking a multi-layered approach to healing.
Yeah, meeting the person where they are, and recognizing that everyone's journey is different.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Definitely not. And that's something Dr. Williams really emphasizes throughout the book. Healing is a process. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a willingness to kind of delve into those deeper layers of ourselves.
And that's probably a good place to pause for now.
Sounds good to me. There's so much more to unpack.
We'll dive back into those deeper layers in part 2.
And you know what? All of that leads us to another really important concept Dr. Williams explores: intergenerational trauma.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that term before, but I'll admit I'm not totally clear on what it actually means. How does trauma actually get passed down, like, through generations?
Well, it's not as simple as like inheriting your mom's eye color or something.
Hmm.
It's more about the transmission of beliefs and behaviors and coping mechanisms, those things.
So it's not like a gene you inherit.
Not exactly, no. It's more like inheriting a pattern of relating to the world. And often you're not even consciously aware of it. It's just like ingrained in you.
And Dr. Williams uses her own family history to illustrate this, right?
She does, yeah. It's actually quite fascinating. She traces these patterns of anxiety and perfectionism and people-pleasing through 3 generations. Her grandmother, her mother, and herself.
Wow, 3 generations.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get into the specifics here. What were some of the key things she shared about her grandmother?
Well, she describes her grandmother as being very image conscious, like very aware of social status, appearances, that kind of thing. And she was a chronic worrier, constantly anxious.
Oh, wow, so the anxiety goes way back.
Yeah, and it seems like that anxiety was passed down to Dr. Williams's mother.
And how did it show up in her mom's life?
Well, her mom was like a classic people pleaser, always putting others' needs before her own. And she had this deep-seated fear of failure, so she pushed herself to achieve, but it came at a cost.
Yeah, at the expense of her own well-being, which, if you think about it, sounds a lot like the patterns Dr. Williams herself struggled with.
Exactly. It really highlights how these cycles can continue for generations if they're not addressed.
It can feel kind of overwhelming, though, right? Like, oh, great, so I'm destined to repeat my family's dysfunction.
No, not at all. It's not about blame or determinism. It's about understanding, just recognizing that these patterns exist in our families and they might be influencing us. That's a huge step.
Okay, so how would you suggest our listener starts to explore this in their own family? Where do they even begin?
Start with curiosity. If you can, talk to your family members, ask them about their experiences, their beliefs, you might uncover some surprising commonalities.
What if talking to family isn't really an option? Like, what if there's a lot of, conflict or estrangement?
Well, you can still reflect on your own experiences. What are those dominant patterns you see in your family? How have those patterns shaped you? Just becoming aware of these things can be incredibly powerful.
So, starting to connect the dots.
Exactly. It's like putting together a puzzle.
I know Dr. Williams also spends a good chunk of the book talking about shame. She calls it the silent killer. Why do you think she's so focused on shame? What makes it so, powerful?
Shame it's insidious, It's that feeling of being fundamentally flawed, unworthy, not good enough at your core, and it thrives in secrecy.
You want to hide, right?
Exactly. It isolates us. It makes it really, really hard to reach out for help, to let anyone see that part of ourselves.
And you mentioned earlier her work with prisoners, how that really highlighted the power of shame. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so she would have these sessions where prisoners had to write about their crimes, their offenses, what she calls offense accounts.
Okay, interesting.
And the shame was palpable in those sessions, you know. Some could own up to their actions, express remorse, but others, they were completely shut down.
Makes sense.
They'd deflect, they'd minimize anything to avoid facing that deep sense of unworthiness.
Which is totally human, right? I mean, nobody wants to feel shame. It's painful.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so tricky, because you can't heal it if you keep pushing it away.
So if we're trying to heal from shame, where do we even begin? Like, how do we fight back against something so deeply ingrained?
Well, Dr. Williams, she doesn't leave us hanging. She gives us a whole toolbox of strategies, actually.
Okay, I like that. Give us some tools.
Well, one of the most important is cultivating self-compassion. Learning to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would offer a close friend.
Instead of beating yourself up all the time?
Exactly. She also talks about the importance of, like, challenging negative self-talk, setting healthy boundaries, and of course, seeking professional support if needed.
I like that she's very action-oriented. She doesn't just tell you what's wrong, she actually gives you things to do about it.
Yeah, it's not just about reading the book and having these aha moments. It's about actually putting these ideas into practice, doing the inner work.
And all of this brings us to self-compassion, which Dr. Williams presents as like the antidote to shame. What exactly does that look like, though?
It's really about turning toward yourself with kindness, acceptance and understanding, even when you mess up, even when you feel like you're not good enough.
Being your own best friend, basically.
Exactly. And she breaks it down into three core components: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness.
Those are great. Can you explain those a little bit more? I think it'd be helpful for our listener to like really get what each one is about.
Okay, sure. So self-kindness is about quieting that inner critic, that voice that's always telling you you're not good enough, smart enough, thin enough, whatever it is. It's about offering yourself support and encouragement instead of judgment.
And common humanity.
Common humanity is the reminder that we all struggle. We all have those moments where we feel insecure or inadequate or like we're failing. It's part of being human.
It takes the pressure off a little, right? Knowing you're not alone in your struggles.
Exactly. And then there's mindfulness. Mindfulness is about bringing a gentle awareness to your thoughts and feelings without judging them.
So not getting swept away in the current of your emotions.
That's a good way to put it. It's about creating that space to just be with yourself as you are in this moment.
Sounds like a pretty tall order, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, especially if you're used to being really hard on yourself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it can be. It's definitely a practice. But Dr. Williams gives you specific tools to get started. Things like writing yourself a letter from the perspective of a compassionate friend, or practicing guided meditations. Even just starting with 5 minutes a day can make a huge difference.
I remember her talking about the importance of tackling negative self-talk, too, which I think ties in with all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Negative self-talk, it's like that constant loop of criticism and judgment playing in your head. And it can be so sneaky because we often don't even realize we're doing it.
So how do we, like, break that loop? How do we start to challenge those thoughts?
Well, it starts with awareness. Pay attention to that inner voice. What is it saying to you? When does it tend to pipe up? And then instead of just accepting those thoughts as truth, start questioning them.
Asking yourself, is this really true? Or would I say this to a friend?
Exactly. It's like retraining your brain, learning to talk to yourself with more kindness and understanding.
It's like giving yourself a pep talk instead of a beatdown.
Haha, I like that. And all of this leads nicely into her big idea: powerfully imperfect living, which is the focus of the book's final chapter.
I love that phrase, powerfully imperfect. It's so catchy.
And it really captures the essence of what Dr. Williams is trying to convey, Powerfully imperfect living is about embracing those imperfections, letting go of that need for perfection that drives so much of our suffering.
She uses a really cool analogy to explain this, right? Something about surfing.
Oh, yeah. She talks about learning to surf and how it became this metaphor for life. Like, you're going to have those moments of flow, riding the waves, feeling amazing.
But then you're also going to wipe out, like, a lot.
Oh, yeah, a lot. And those wipeouts, she argues, are just as important as the rides. They teach you resilience, they force you to adapt, they make you a better surfer in the long run.
So it's not about avoiding the wipeouts, it's about learning how to navigate them.
Exactly. It's like that saying, fall down 7 times, get up 8. Powerfully imperfect living is about recognizing that those moments of imperfection, those wipeouts, aren't failures, they're opportunities.
It's a shift in perspective.
Totally. It's about moving away from that self-critical, perfectionistic mindset and embracing the like messy, imperfect beauty of being human.
So if someone's listening and thinking, okay, I love this idea, but how do I actually start living this way? What would you say? Where do they even begin?
I think it starts with awareness, you know? Pay attention to those moments when you're being really critical of yourself or judgmental or just holding yourself to this impossible standard. And when you catch those thoughts, challenge them. Ask yourself, would I say this to a friend, or is this actually helpful?
So it's like catching yourself in the act and then choosing a different path.
Right. And it's not about becoming this like perfectly self-accepting person overnight. It's about making those small, consistent shifts in how you relate to yourself.
So progress over perfection, basically.
Exactly. Powerfully imperfect living, it's not a destination, it's a way of life. It's about showing up each day and choosing to be kind to yourself, even when you mess up.
Which you will.
Oh, yeah, we all will. That's the beauty of it. We're all perfectly imperfect.
It's about finding the joy and the meaning in those imperfections.
Absolutely. And Dr. Williams really drives this point home. Our imperfections are often the source of our greatest strengths. Our creativity, our resilience, our compassion. Those things all come from those messy, imperfect parts of ourselves. Like, those are the things that make us, well, us. You know what I mean?
I do. Like our quirks, the things we might see as flaws, those are often the things that make us interesting and relatable.
And even lovable. It's that vulnerability, that willingness to be like less than perfect that allows for real connection, I think.
I love that idea. What if the things we try so hard to hide, the things that make us feel broken, are actually the keys to something like beautiful?
That's such a good question. And it's definitely something Dr. Williams wants us to think about. It's not about just like loving your flaws or something, you know, it's deeper than that.
It's not just toxic positivity.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that maybe those imperfections aren't things to be ashamed of, but parts of ourselves to be explored, to be understood, to even be embraced.
Okay, so let's bring it back to our listener for a minute. We've covered a lot of ground here. Small t, trauma, perfectionism, attachment styles, how trauma gets passed down through families, shame, self-compassion, this whole idea of powerfully imperfect living.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
So how do we synthesize all of this? What are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the core message is one of hope and healing, you know?
Yeah.
Dr. Williams is giving us a roadmap, a way to understand our struggles, to break free from those patterns that are holding us back, and to start living a more wholehearted and authentic life.
And she reminds us that we're not alone in this. Everyone's carrying some kind of baggage, some wounds from the past.
Right. Everyone feels not good enough sometimes, and that's okay. It's part of being human.
It's normal to feel broken sometimes.
Exactly. What matters is that we have the capacity to heal, to learn, to grow, to become more compassionate towards ourselves and others. That's the message of hope that shines through in Dr. Williams' work.
And she doesn't just leave it at theory, right? She gives really practical advice and resources.
Oh, totally. She includes a workbook you can download, links to her podcast, suggestions for finding a therapist. She really wants people to take action.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into what to do when you feel broken, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. What if your imperfections are not flaws to be hidden, but stepping stones to something greater? What if those cracks and scars, those things that make you feel broken, are actually where your light shines through? Explore Dr. Williams' work. Keep digging into these ideas and see what you discover.